What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode is the one and only Scott Galloway. Scott is a professor of marketing at NYU's Stern School of Business, a serial entrepreneur, a prolific media personality, and the author of 4 books, the most recent of which attempts to tell the story of America, from the end of World War II to the present day, in order to understand how we arrived at this precarious moment in our nation's history, the challenges that lie before us, and what it will take to navigate those challenges successfully so we can emerge from this period with our nationhood and humanity intact. As I've said on this podcast many times, in a democratic society, power ultimately rests with the people, with you and me. It's a cliché, but it's true. And when things don't feel like they're working out, we can either throw up our hands and blame somebody else, or we can make the effort to engage constructively on the challenges that confront all of us. Today's episode is a roadmap to understanding what some of those challenges are, where they came from, how to address them, and why there are reasons to be hopeful about the future and this imperfect experiment that is America. For anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. I don't rely on advertisers or commercial sponsors, which is why the second hour of our conversations is normally available to premium subscribers only. If you want access to our full episode library, as well as the transcripts and intelligence reports, which include my takeaways from every episode and my thoughts on what comes next, head over to hiddenforces.io, select the episode that you're interested in, and click on the premium extras, where you can then sign up to one of our premium content tiers. If you have questions about our Genius tier, which includes access to the Hidden Forces community, Q&A calls with guests, in-person events, and dinners, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this excellent conversation with my guest, Scott Galloway. Scott Galloway, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Demetri, thanks for having me here.
It's great having you on, Scott. So how long have you been doing your podcast for?
Pivot's about coming up on 2.5 years, and Prop G about 1.5 years.
Prof G's only 1.5 years? Why do I feel like I've been listening to it for, I feel like I came across
because it's painful. Time's going slow. It's like torture, right? An hour in the dentist chair. No, it's
That's
been
weird.
About 1.5 years.
I somehow I had it in my head that I remember you doing a podcast years ago that was actually conversational. I mean, Prof G has evolved to something else. I was talking with Drew about it before, but anyway, that's interesting. I'm in a time loop. It's COVID. It's everything. So we're here to talk about your book, Adrift. In the opening of the book, you say that you chose data that tells the story of America as you see it. What is the story that you are trying to tell in this book?
It's like the questions you know you're going to get are the hardest. So first off, you have to acknowledge just the remarkable achievements of America. If you were to have a headline, you can only have one newspaper headline for the last 100 years in America, would be that we'd partnered with the Russians and the British in using brains, brawn, and blood, fought back or turned back fascism. If you could only have one headline for the last 50 years in America, it would probably be unprecedented prosperity. So I think we have to acknowledge just how the scale and awe of our achievements. I think there are some fairly serious issues that we need to address, ranging from polarization to income inequality to failing young men to teen depression. And that's the bad news, is I think they're all pretty serious. The good news is I think they're all solvable. And the reason I chose the title Adrift in America, Not Lost in America, is that we can see land. We've been there before. If we can reduce child poverty by 50% with the child tax credit during COVID, we know how to do this. If our teens were not being admitted to hospitals in the record numbers they are now with self-harm, if we didn't have 2,000 to 6,000 families in emergency rooms every night because the kids are so depressed, the parents literally don't know what to do, so they take them to the emergency room. Before that, we didn't have it, so we can absolutely fix that. When we had a progressive tax structure, there wasn't the same. The middle class was doing better. So when I applied to UCLA and it was 76% admissions rates, and it was not only accessible but affordable, we know how to do all of these things. We made massive investments in technology, our government did, and there was huge spillover. Every really kind of $1 trillion plus company was sort of built on the back of massive public infrastructure investment. So the bad news is there's some pretty serious issues. The good news is I think they're all absolutely solvable. And I would say that the summary of the book would be there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed with what's right with America.
So I think you have 100 charts in the book. I think it says it in the top of the book. I mean, I didn't count each individual one. Some of them were actually, I would call them like kind of like infographics, or you have a few of those with the heads of CEOs. Yep. What I'm curious to understand before we delve into some of the specific themes that you explore in the book, I'm curious to understand how you went about choosing the charts. And I mean, were there a set of essential questions that you were looking to explore? And if so, like how did that all come together? How have you come over time to focus on these particular things?
So whenever you write a book, you try and figure out an arc, right? So the easy part was picking. I love charts. We've had an alphabet for 1,500 years. We've been interpreting images for tens of thousands, whether it's cave walls or meeting times based on the height of the sun in the sky. So we absorb images or we process them 6 to 60 times faster than words. So it's just a better way to hit our species with meaning and purpose. They just can see a chart and immediately it hits them what its meaning. So picking the 100 charts was not that difficult because we include charts in our newsletter, No Mercy, No Malice, every week. So we literally have hundreds, if not thousands of charts. So picking the 100 most compelling wasn't that hard. What's harder, Demetri, have you ever written a book?
No, I haven't.
So the hardest thing is coming up with an arc. You'll have a bunch of ideas. You'll have something interesting to say. The hardest thing is stringing together a narrative or story, because something we're also good at as a species is absorbing and remembering things in the context of a story. So I thought, okay, we need to acknowledge the accomplishments of America. I wanted to talk about the middle class as a ballast for not only our society, but every society. If you compare us to China, China's brought 500 million people into the middle class over the last 4 decades. We've actually lost people. A decent proxy for how any nation is doing economically, psychologically, militarily is the number of people it's been able to put into its middle class. So I spent a lot of time talking about the importance of the middle class. I spent a lot of time talking about failing young men. You're a young man. As you get older, you think, what cohort can I champion? You know, if you're fortunate enough to have the immediate people around you, your immediate surroundings healthy and happy, you want to have a legacy, you want to give back. So you pick a cohort to champion. The cohort I've picked is young men who I think have fallen further faster than any cohort in America. And then talk about higher ed, just because I think I know it fairly well. Talk a little bit about technology and social media and big tech, which has been kind of my focus. And then talk about recommendations. So sort of parsing, slicing, dicing, and trying to put it all into a narrative.
Yeah, and a lot of these things obviously like feed into one another, right? So you have young men, and then you also talk about something else with online dating. And online dating obviously pulls in some of the, for lack of a better word, algorithms that we associate with social media.
Yeah.
So it's kind of unfair to ask you to focus on one.
Sure.
But if you had to pick one thing that you think is paramount or accelerating in its importance in society, could you identify it? Is there something that you would point to? Is it, for example, the combination of social media and mobile devices and the kind of addictive quality of our phones?
I mean, it depends the day you talk. I will pick one, but a lot of it is the day and my blood sugar level. So today I've been thinking a lot about how geopolitically we're probably as strong as we've ever been. We're food independent, we're energy independent. The smartest, hardest working, most innovative people and companies all have one thing in common. They want to come to America. So we're a sports team. If every top recruit everywhere in the world wanted to come play for us, we have enormous advantages. But at the same time, the call is kind of coming from inside of the house, and that is we're eating each other. We're literally dying from the inside out, and that is 54% of Democrats are worried about their son or daughter marrying a Republican. A third of people in each party believe that the other party is their mortal enemy. There's now fairly significant support for an autocracy as long as your guy or gal was elected. And I think that these platforms, because of their incentives to create rage and make our discourse more coarse, also their weaponization by foreign entities and bad actors, is a real problem. Having said that, I would argue that the biggest problem facing America right now, and it's a function of a lot of things, income inequality, a lack of investment in young people, social media, is failing young men. And that is, if you walk down the avenue that is America over the next 5 years, for every one male college graduate, there's going to be 2 female college graduates. And a third of the men under the age of 30 will not have had sex in the last year. And people hear the term sex and their brain goes to different places. But sex is a key component of establishing what I think is the elemental foundation of any society, and that is productive relationships. And I worry that we are producing too many of the most dangerous person in the world, and that is a young, broke, and lonely male. And if you look at societies that are most violent and most unstable, they have a lot of these individuals. And you talked about online dating, just some data. If there are 50 men on Tinder and 50 women on Tinder, 46 of the women will show all of their attention to just 4 of the men, leaving 46 men to try and vie for 4 women. So you have this kind of Porsche polygamy effect where the top 10% of men in terms of online attractiveness get 90% of the opportunities, which means the bottom 50% of men from a digital attractiveness standpoint are totally shut out of the market. The kind of 50 to 90 do okay. The top 10% get too much opportunity, which doesn't encourage long-term relationships and can lead to bad behavior. And dating just in general is just sort of slightly shittier for all women. So what we have is we're producing too many economically and emotionally unviable young men. This leads to lower birth rates, lower economic stability because households with 2 earners tend to aggregate wealth faster. And then this group that's being shut out that has no mating opportunities are much more prone to be attracted to misogynistic content. They're much less likely to believe in climate change. They're more likely to engage in conspiracy theory. The guy that rushed the stage and attacked Salman Rushdie, in my view, that wasn't about the fatwa. That was about a young man with no opportunity living in his mother's basement. And when you hear about mass shooters, we kind of all know who it is before we know who it is. So I think that the amount of investment in young people has been seriously and deliberately diminished. People under the age of 40 used to control 19% of the GDP. Now they control 9%. Our biggest tax deductions all go to older people, either for owning a home or owning a stock. Who owns their home and owns stocks? Older people. Who rents and makes all of their money with current income? Younger people. So I think there's been this concerted, deliberate policy strategy to transfer wealth from young people to old people. And the people who have been hit hardest amongst young people have been young men who don't mature as fast as women, do worse in single-parent households. Girls actually have similar outcomes, whether it's 2-parent household or single. Boys kind of come off the tracks without a male role model. So I would argue that in terms of a society digressing into more chaos, more conspiracy theory, it ripples right up into our electorate. And I apologize, I'll stop after this. But you've had more women graduating from college for the last 40 years than men. Almost every elected representative has a college degree, which would lead you to believe that we'd have more women as elected representatives than men. But we don't. It's 28% of our elected representatives are women. Because I believe that instinctively we conflate deep voices and height with leadership characteristics. And so what you have is a small number of failing men who are this powerful voting bloc. And the first presidential primaries are in older, whiter states. So you have representation that will disproportionately cater to the needs, what I'll call an uneducated white male who tends to be, and this isn't a stereotype, but angry. And so you have Trump rallies where you have QAnon symbols. You have presidential candidates who make very misogynistic statements and the crowd goes crazy. So I think it's leading us to a very dangerous and ugly place. And I think a lot of it starts with the economic opportunities that have been taken away from a younger cohort that is disproportionately impacting young men. That was a word salad.
Shit, Scott. Shit, I tried to take down as many notes as possible, but you made a lot of good points that I want to try and follow. I don't know if we'll be able to. Quick statistic. Remind me of the statistic again. What percentage of men under the age of what don't have sex in a year?
So if you meet a male under the age of 30, 1 in 3 of them haven't had sex in the past 12 months.
What was that statistic 20 or 30 years ago?
I don't know what it was, but it's at a record high since the 60s when views around sex started getting a little more relaxed. The number of kids high school kids that see their friends every day has been cut in half. So there's some good things. There's not as much teen pregnancy. There's not as many drunk driving accidents. But at the end of the day, we're not as social. There's a crisis in loneliness. And that is when men live at home and they have no guardrails, they don't have no girlfriend, they have no job they have to show up for, they tend to just not do as well. They need guardrails. They need someone in a vested emotional connection or relationship to help them or guide them, or quite frankly, just serve as a check and balance. But it's just in general, whether it's Boy or Girl Scouts, speaking to your neighbor, attending church, playing in a softball league, whatever it is, anything where we touch, smell, and feel one another in person, those numbers are all down across the board.
So first, I remember it must have been like 2012, I think it was, or 2013, if my memory is correct, where I read an article about something similar happening in South Korean society around kids not having sex. So assuming that there's been a significant drop-off, what perhaps some of us intuit from what we see since the 1960s, 70s, whatever, what accounts for that? Why is it that if people are having less sex, meaningfully less sex, why is that?
Well, in the case of America, it's that with online dating, so it used to be 1 in 3 people met online. Now it's 1 in 2. And online dating is very two-dimensional. And women have essentially 3 criteria for mating. The first is resources. The second is intelligence. And the third is kindness. It doesn't matter how rich and how smart you are. If you're an asshole, you don't make for a good long-term mate. Online, you can primarily get across one of those things. You can get across your wealth. And so if you're the right zip code, the right job, and your Rolex accidentally ends up in your profile picture, you get a lot of swipe rights. And so there's been this disproportionate crowding. Whenever digitization enters a category, whether it's retail, whether it's social media, and now mating, it consolidates it. It becomes a winner-take-most environment. 50% of online retail to one player, 93% of search, 66% of all social, just to one company, right? And the same thing is happening with mating. So the first is this consolidation or winner-take-most effect, because if you went to temple every week, it was sort of the 8 single guys, the 8 single gals, and they sort of paired up, and the pheromones, humor, whatever it might be, the strangeness of mating that's so wonderful would take over, whereas online dating is very one or at most two-dimensional. 2, because of COVID and because of work from home, because people aren't going to the mall, they're not going to the movie theater, people just aren't interacting as much. And also with the plethora of socialization and dopa hits, whether it's a gambling dopa hit, which is hidden under the notion of investing or trading on Robinhood, whether it's, quite frankly, you don't feel... I used to go on campus at UCLA in the hopes that not only might I get a chance to attend class, but that I would meet women. I'm not sure if I had the abundance of porn that is available now, if I would feel the same drive to go out and meet women. And what I say to young men is I'm not sort of naive. I'm not telling young men not to engage in porn. What I'm saying is try and limit it and find that mojo such that you can go out and develop the social skills required to actually find someone to have sex with and make your own bad porn. I think that porn has led to unreasonable expectations among men around what it means to be in a relationship with a woman. I also think, bottom line, some of it's just misogynistic, some of it's just normalized sort of misogynistic behavior. And 2, it decreases your mojo to get out there and put up with the socialization and the work and looking good and getting a job and talking to strangers, establishing a conversation, quite frankly, getting used to rejection. That's okay. That's a key component of success. Talking to someone, finding out they're not interested in you, and then realizing you're going to be okay. And that leads to what is one of the elemental foundations of success, and that is grit and perseverance. And I have started a lot of companies that have failed, but the reason I'm economically secure is it didn't devastate me. It was upsetting, but then I got up, dusted off my pants and started again. The reason why I'm in a relationship with someone who's more talented, higher character, and much better looking than me is I am not afraid of approaching, or I wasn't when I was a younger man, occasionally taking a risk and approaching someone and starting a conversation. I met my current partner at the pool at the Raleigh Hotel, and I walked into the pool, I saw her, and I said, before I leave here, I promised myself, before I leave here, I'm going to go speak to that woman. I worry too many young men are at home, not getting out, not developing those skills, and also more emotionally fragile because of social media, which is a constant cycle where they're getting reaction, action all day long digitally, and they find dopa hits and other things that don't result in wealth and don't result in relationships. I worry, if you bought a puppy, I'm really into dogs, the first thing to tell you is as soon as the thing gets to 8 weeks, get it around other dogs. One of my kids really struggled in COVID, and it was like loosely speaking because he couldn't be in school. But what kids need more than anything, even more than school, is other kids. And the same is true of our species. We're a social species. The more we're around other people, generally the happier we are. And the elemental foundation, we talk a lot about economics and prosperity, but at the end of the day, that's just the means. The reason you want economic security is such that you can provide opportunity and take the stress out of your relationships, such that you can do nice things with your family, such that you can afford to put food on the table, such that you can take care of your parents when they get older, such that you're not up all night worrying about paying the rent, such that you're not engaged in your kids' lives, you're so stressed. So in America, like one of the taglines would be prosperity without progress. We have unbelievable economic prosperity, mostly crowded around the top 10%. But if we're not getting together, if we're not forming friendships, relationships, if we're not loving, if we're not taking care of people, if we're not having sex, what's the point? What's the point of any of this? So I'm a big fan. I try and coach some young men, and I'm like, whatever's required, whether it's getting into an office, joining a softball league, getting a job, anything, you need to get out every day for the majority of the day and kind of bounce off of people.
Again, lots of interesting thoughts. When you were talking about the abundance of porn, I had a couple of thoughts. One was, it reminded me of that movie, There's Something About Mary.
Yeah.
Ben Stiller.
I think, yeah,
am I remembering correctly that he, oh no, that was actually the opposite lesson. I'm not even going to go into it, but we can touch base on that one later. But it has something to do with that, with not blowing your load ahead of time or blowing it ahead of time and not performing better. Anyway, total digression, not where I meant this to go. I was also reminded of a really great documentary that I watched recently, and we had the director on, Alex Lee Moyer. The documentary was called TFW No GF, which stands for That Feeling When No Girlfriend. And it looked at, quote, incels. It looked at basically, it chronicled the lives of, I think, 3 different or 4 different young men. Mm-hmm. And it really was something to behold, to actually watch this documentary and see what their lives were like, how they spent their days, and how introverted they were. And I do think there's something else I thought about when you were talking about this, about sex and like, all the different stimulation. There's I'm on Twitter and I'm on Instagram, very rarely on Instagram, but I get thrown all sorts of pornographic type ads, not on Twitter, but like on Instagram. Mm-hmm. And I've searched for stuff on Twitter that's not pornographic, and something pornographic will show up on Twitter, which is wild to me. So there is clearly this kind of abundance of pornography that exists in the world today that didn't when I was growing up. But also this thing, and this is where I want to drive it at, sex channels libido. Libido can manifest in all sorts of ways. And to your point, like if you're not having sex, that's going to manifest, you could manifest as aggression. And there are all sorts of ways in which you can try to exercise that kind of libido. And one of them is, a healthy way is trying to exercise power in the world, to feel like your life has meaning, that your work matters, that your life matters, that if you die tomorrow, people will notice. And I wonder, how much all of this connects with the increased incidence of depression. I'm somewhat familiar with these statistics. We did one episode on this with Johan Hari. We did another episode on the phenomenon of loneliness, but also this is just one of those things that you just see anecdotally in the world. Like people around you tend to be more depressed, at least for me, over the course of the last 20 years of my life. So I'm curious, how that factors in your mind, this idea, this with sex, partnership, loneliness, etc., depression, and the power process, your life meaning something.
Yeah, I think all of that has a lot of event overlap. And when I say, there's a tragedy or it's unfortunate that men under the age of 30 aren't having as much sex, what I mean is it's a tragedy when people don't have relationships. And sex is a fundamental step typically to a long-term relationship. It's an indicator of something worse. I think loneliness is the new cancer. We never talked about cancer. Now we do, and we're making big progress against it. Then we start talking about mental illness. It's no longer taboo, and we're having a really productive conversation around that. If you're lonely, it's like smoking, they think, about 17 cigarettes a day. You're just more likely to have a heart attack. You're more likely to get depressed. You're more likely to, almost nothing good comes from loneliness. Those Japanese soldiers that were left in the Filipino islands and given a command to just wreak havoc, and they went into the hills and survived for 20 years, they accomplished nothing. They weren't self-actualized. They were more depressed. They didn't come up with any innovation around survival. They just would occasionally come into some hapless village in the Philippines and wreak havoc and then descend back to the hills. We are a social species. Greatness is in the agency of others. I mean, our species doesn't continue unless we find someone to mate with. And that's not to say that you can't be happy without a mate. I'm not one of these people that believes you can't be happy without children. The fundamental element in happiness always comes down to one thing across demographics, ethnicities, geographic boundaries, and that is the number of deep and meaningful relationships that you have. And when from a young age you're taught that it's just easier to play a video game than playing sports, it's easier, or you believe it's easier, to trade Solana on CoinDesk and buy puts or calls on AMC or GameStop because you read about it on a Reddit message board, and there's some indication you make some money and you think, wow, I'm an investor, I'm learning. No, you're not, you're gambling. And the institutional production of DOPA we just haven't caught up to the institutional production. Salt, sugar, fatty foods, porn, gambling or risk-taking, all of these things are awesome in the sense that we haven't had enough of them. It's been scarcity until the last 50, 40, 20, 10 years. And now that they are in superabundance and you can go down a rabbit hole of porn and always find new stuff, you can find cheap food that's very high in calories and fat, which we could have never found. So our species goes, oh my God, before winter comes, eat as much as you can. And then young men being taught that 85% of gambling addicts are men. It's got the highest suicide rate of any addiction because people don't know how deep you've gotten into it before it's too late. If you're a meth addict, people will figure it out and they will try and intervene. You could have mortgaged your house, your kid's future, spent all of your money and be hundreds of thousands in debt, and people don't know. And so people feel as if there's no way out. So this superabundance in this rabbit hole, if we don't teach young men, especially young men whose prefrontal cortex doesn't fully form as quickly, who are much more risk aggressive, if we don't teach them in modulation behavior, it's just easy to see how they end up at home, vaping, watching video games, doing porn, and occasionally trying to trade Solana. It's not hard to imagine how that happens. And they get false signals that, oh, you're not gambling, you're investing. It's Robinhood. Porn is everywhere. Maybe you can make some money remotely. And young men, in my view, need to get into the office. I think they need to learn how to read a room. I think they need to learn how to groom themselves. They need to learn how to establish contacts and relationships with other people. And women need this as well. They typically don't need it as much. They typically are better at establishing social connections from a young age more naturally than men do. And if you look at just the data around, in urban cities, women have actually surpassed men in terms of compensation. It's women when they have kids that their compensation plummets. But there's going to be 2 female college graduates for every 1 male college graduate over the next 5 years. So you have males that are sort of, I would argue we have an entire cohort or an entire generation of young men who aren't economically or emotionally viable. And this creates loneliness, not only among men, but among women. And whether it's the percentage of people that talk to their neighbors, go to church, engage in Boy or Girl Scouts, all of those numbers have dropped off a cliff. And the result is loneliness, which is damaging to us physically and emotionally.
So let's stick with this. How do we address this issue?
I think there's a variety of solutions. I think one of them, and there's a bunch, but one of them is service. And that is, I think we should have some sort of mandatory conscription or service, national service, similar to what the Israelis do or some nations in Northern Europe do. And that is for 1 and 2 years between high school and college, or sometimes before the age of 25, you do a year or 2 years of national service. And it doesn't necessarily need to be military service. It can be social service, whatever it might be. But one of the reasons we had so much great legislation in the 50s and 60s, and we got along, was that the majority of our leaders had served in a uniform and saw themselves as Americans well before they saw themselves as Republicans or Democrats. I think it'd be really helpful for young people to be around other young people from different income, ethnic backgrounds, different sexual orientations. But the thing they all have in common is that they're Americans serving in the agency of America. Because I think we've lost that connective tissue. I think there's a lack of patriotism. I think there's a lack of appreciation for how wonderful America is. When I went to high school, there were poor kids, there were rich kids, and there was some friction. It wasn't all like a Hallmark Channel movie. But you developed empathy. My best friend was a fairly affluent white Mormon kid who was going to Stanford. And that taught me, okay, he's smarter than I am, but he's not that much smarter. Maybe I can go to a good school. My other best friend was a kid named Ronnie Drake, who was a black kid who was a football player who, if he didn't get a football scholarship, was not going to college. And in mid-season hurt his neck, which was devastating for him. And I think I'd like to think I'm more empathetic because I hadn't been exposed to that reality up until that point. Now, schools are totally segregated. I went back to my high school, and it's primarily lower and middle-income kids of color. And I don't think that's good. I don't think it's good that we have segregated. We've withdrawn to our mini compounds. Where do we see the single mother? Where do we see the homeless veteran if we're not going to the mall? We're not driving to work. We're not going to the movie theater. Our schools are totally segregated. And we have no connective tissue. We didn't serve in the agency of anything. I'm an atheist. I've never bought into organized religion, but I buy into the notion of everybody getting together once a week to appreciate each other, to appreciate kindness, to think about other people. And whatever the format is for that, it's just declining. And especially among young men who are I think they hit a point where if they don't go to college, they don't have a job, they don't develop these skills, these social skills, and they start getting angry and they turn it inward. And it's just a downward spiral. And it's like, why go to the effort of meeting people when I can get a reasonable facsimile of that dope ahead through electronic means? And then I think they just wake up anxious and angry and lonely increasingly.
So the major impediment here, I think, ultimately is politics. One could also make the argument that technology itself, which has accrued the technologies that we use, and I use this term very broadly, quote, technology, that many of these platforms that have increased market share, especially in the attention economy, which are controlled by a small network of elites who have consolidated power. One could argue that this is actually the bottleneck. Unfortunately, there's no way to address that without going through the political route of going through the government. It's ultimately the government that's vested with the power to address through regulation and force issues that are possibly detrimental to our capacity to govern ourselves as a result of, again, these technological and forces of the economy and of elites and concentration of power. So it's politics ultimately that's a bottleneck for us here. And our politics is, I really struggle with this, man, because I really don't like the way that everybody kind of talks. Lots of people talk about politics because I feel like it's so unconstructive and it's so easy to reach for inflammatory words and emotional words. And I don't want to do that. I don't quite know how to talk about what's happening here. Yes, it's tribal. It's complicated. They're really old people in government that have lots of power. They're vested interests. People have lost trust. Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., Russian misinformation. There's so much that's going on. But at the end of the day, like, we are a liberal democracy. We are ultimately accountable to ourselves. And it feels like at bottom, a lot of people in this country aren't willing to really play ball. It feels like they're kind of just like, this is bullshit. I'm done. Let it burn. And that's the thing for me that, like, if that, and I don't know if that resonates with you, and maybe I'll just kind of open this as an open-ended question, like, what do you think is going on? What is really the root of the problem in our politics that we're not really able to address these issues? Or is it just that we need to have it out? You know what I'm saying? Like, we just have to go at it until it's over, whether that is a World War II scenario, whether that's a civil war. Not does that have to be like, we're not going to go set up and fight, battles across enemy lines. But I mean, what is it going to take to kind of resolve these issues politically?
Yeah, there's a lot there. And as you've pointed out, there's a lot of dimensions to these issues. And a lot of what I'm going to say is just parroting back my colleague, Jonathan Haidt, who I think has written more eloquently on the problems of polarization in our society than almost anyone. But there's a few kind of best practices or worst practices we can point to. Money in politics and gerrymandering that has created these very hard left or hard right congressional districts. And as a result, we produce extremist candidates on both sides. So there's just no room for moderates. And the majority, we have minority representation now. The majority of Americans believe in safe access to family planning. But if you have hard left and hard right that don't trust each other because of the primary system where the election is the primary, because they're either hard left or hard right districts because they all like their jobs, and once they're incumbents, they don't want any churn, so they make their districts solidly blue or solidly red. The result is really far left or far right candidates. And the result there is that we end up with a government that won't work together, that is constantly just looking to embarrass the other side. We now vote for candidates based on who does the better. And this is what I think people don't get about Trump. We on the left are just so offended that the Republicans vote for that person because we think that means they've adopted a philosophy of mocking the disabled or of misogyny or of not paying your vendors, or of hiding nuclear access codes in the golf cart room. But where politics are now, and this is true on the left, we vote for the person who does the best job of embarrassing the other side. AOC is so popular, not only because, and I like AOC, I think she's good at promoting her constituencies, but what she's really good at is clapping back at the other side. And over the last 10 years, voters have been drawn to whoever makes the other side look worse because they're angry. So that's the first thing is I think money in politics has also created a tax code that's gone from 400 pages to 4,000. And when you can navigate by starlight, you want to run boat races at night. And so the wealthy and corporations can navigate the complexity of the tax code and figure out ways to find loopholes, whereas the middle and lower income taxpayers don't get the opportunities to kind of take advantage of this increasing complexity. Complexity is just a tax on the poor. We've been able to automate audits, but only simple audits. So who gets automated and gets audited on a regular basis now? Lower and middle income people. Whereas when wealthy people are audited, it takes a lot of domain expertise and resources because their tax returns are so goddamn complex, which means their audit rates have gone down. So simplifying the tax code. 23% of GDP goes to government. And if you're using a lot of it in deficit spending, that means tax rates across the board should be 20%. So if you had everyone up to 100,000 pay 10% and everyone above, call it 100 to 1,000, a million 20, and then everyone above a million 30, you'd probably run a budget surplus. I've been starting and selling businesses to make a living. My last business, L2, I sold for a lot of money. The first $10 million, I got tax-free. That just makes no fucking sense. And people say, well, the guys like you won't start businesses. I couldn't tell you the tax rate of at any time I started a business. That's not why people start businesses. So we have a regressive tax structure. We have a system that transfers wealth from people your age to my age, right? When you're young, you rent and you make your money through current income. Pay the highest tax rates. I make my money by selling businesses and selling stocks, and I own a home. Mortgage tax, mortgage interest rates, and capital gains are the two biggest tax deductions. That's a direct transfer of young people to old people. The people getting the biggest rates in the world right now are seniors getting a cost of living adjustment, the biggest ever because of inflation. We transfer $1.5 trillion from people your age to people a little bit older than me in the form of Social Security. It was an amazing program. It took seniors out of poverty. But why are we transferring money to the wealthiest generation in the history of our planet? So public policy needs to be turned back to where we say we need to level up young people. And you ask for solutions. We should be making a massive investment in the expansion of freshman seats at our great public universities and also vocational programs, recognizing that not every kid wants to go to college. If UCLA and Berkeley started 1 year programs in cybersecurity, $10,000, maybe it's $10,000 tuition, maybe you borrow that money. There is a line out the door of recruiters who want those jobs and will pay you 80 to 120, specialty construction, nursing, health tech. We need education that fits better to the mainline economy, and we need to bust out of this notion that you have failed as a parent if your kid doesn't go to MIT and end up at KKR. There's a lot of mainline jobs out there. 50% of Germany has some sort of a vocational certification. In the US, it's less than 5 because we've fetishized these elite college degrees and going to work in big tech or for some sort of private equity firm. There's a lot we could do. Transfer money back to young people. figure out more vocational programs, expand our public. When I applied to UCLA, Demetri, where'd you go to school?
I went to your school, NYU.
You went to NYU. Okay. We have convinced people to borrow more money to go to NYU than any university in the world.
I mean, isn't it $70,000 with board if you paid full way a year? I think that's...
No. It's 72 just for tuition. Just for tuition?
No
$72,000 in tuition. No housing, no food.
That's, wow.
No, I think it's just $72,000 tuition. So, and then you have the NYU logo in back of you, and you have a financial aid person putting paperwork in front of you, convincing you that it's okay, or saying it's okay to borrow $100,000 or $200,000 to get a degree in history from NYU, knowing that some of those, maybe a lot of those people won't be able to pay it back, or they will really struggle. Now, to borrow money to go to my school, the Stern School, the average compensation coming out of Stern, the business school, is $212,000. That's a good bet. But very easily, you could just say to universities, you are responsible for 10, 20, 50% of bad debt. And they will start doing the math and going, you know what? If you're going to get a philosophy degree from this kind of second-tier university, we're not going to loan you the money because we figured out you may not be able to pay it back. And also the cost explosion, the student debt relief, people were shocked when I said, I don't like this bill because it shrunk the tumor that is student debt by 40%, or really 30%, but the tumor continues to grow. The cancer is the explosion in costs of higher ed. And it starts with one thing. It starts with me and my colleagues are capitalists. We want nice lives. And every morning we wake up and we ask ourselves the same question. How can we increase our compensation while decreasing our accountability? And the way we answer that question is to create this luxury rejectionist positioning. I'm only going to let in 1 in 10 people. We have the money to expand freshman seats, but we will create artificial scarcity, which creates this aspirational Louis Vuitton, Ferrari-like brand positioning. And I can increase my tuition 1,400% over the last 40 years versus 200% for inflation. Education's gone up faster than healthcare. It's gone up so fast. And also, we're going to prey on middle-class homes where parents have been taught to believe if my kids don't graduate from college, I have failed as a parent. So it is predatory. It is wrong. Administrative bloat is out of control. We start leadership and ethics departments. You're telling me I can make a kid more ethical at 27? That's insane. I'm struggling. I think about 10, you can maybe have some impact. After that, it's in the batter, it's their peer group. But the wonderful thing about leaderships and ethics departments is there's no measurable outcomes. So you can think big thoughts and hire people at good compensation. We have diversity and inclusion departments all over America in universities. So we have a department, diversity and inclusion, in the most diverse and inclusive place on the planet. That's not to say we shouldn't be allocating additional resources to kids with different backgrounds who may need more resources to ensure they graduate. I get that. But we consistently create administrative jobs that have no measurable outcomes, so they're not accountable. We pay them well. We have tenure, which is nothing but a welfare program for the overeducated. We have food stamps and unemployment for the undereducated. We have tenure for the overeducated. And the result is out of control costs that have skyrocketed among higher ed. We have this Rolexification of university campuses. When I went to UCLA in the 80s, it looked like shit. And you know what? That was fine. I was okay with that. I found beer, I found friends, I found football games, even if the place didn't look like the Ritz-Carlton Bel Air. And I paid $450 a quarter, and I graduated undergrad and grad with a total of $20,000 in student debt, which was manageable. And my total tuition over 7 years was $7,000, and the admissions rate were 76%. And now we've morphed higher ed into this weirdness where we want to identify the top 1%. And when I say the top 1%, I mean either kids from the top 1% income-earning households that are 77 times more likely to get into an elite university than the other 99%, or the freakishly remarkable, the 17-year-old who's captain of the lacrosse team, builds wells in Africa, and has patents pending for some sort of biotech device, because we've decided higher ed is no longer about giving unremarkable kids remarkable opportunities. It's about trying to identify the top 1% and turn them into billionaires. And here's the thing. No institution can predict who will be remarkable based on bloodline or based on who their parents are. I don't know what you were like when you went to NYU, I was unremarkable. I had a 3.1 GPA from my high school. I had 1130 on the SAT, which was, I think, like 80th percentile.
That's surprising.
And UCLA let me in. 76% admissions rate. I had to apply twice. And then you know what I did? I got a 2.27 GPA from UCLA. I spent the majority of my time making bongs out of household items and watching Planet of the Apes. And I went to work for Morgan Stanley for 2 years. And then Cal, with that GPA, let me into graduate school. They let me in. Can you imagine that now? And I remember the admissions officer calling me and saying, you're not qualified, but you're a native son of California. You know who does not need college? Rich kids. They have the connections. My kids are going to have a better education by the time they get out of high school than I had it coming out of UCLA. But we've decided that I believe higher ed is the tip of the spear for America. And that is every movement, almost every major advance in technology begins at a campus. So it's a forward-looking indicator of where America is headed. And we've lost the script. We've decided we're not about giving unremarkable kids great opportunities. We're about finding freakishly remarkable people and trying them to turn them into billionaires. It has literally become the Hunger Games in the United States. And it just feels very un-American to me. And me and my colleagues are guilty of this rejectionist, NIMBYist bullshit positioning where once you have a house, you don't want anyone else to build housing. Once someone has a college degree, you don't want anyone else to get a degree from your university because your degree will go up in value. And once you have a company that becomes successful, you want to weaponize government to ensure that nobody else can compete and you can act like a monopoly. It's a rejectionist, luxury, NIMBY culture that's very dangerous.
So I'm going to press this question again. It's kind of unfair because I feel like we're all kind of in the same boat trying to answer it, and there's no clear answer. But given all of these things, given the inertia that exists in the system politically, we're not going to be stuck in this position forever, right? Like human societies are dynamic. So what does it take, in your view, to cross the threshold, to change something? Does it have to be some kind of external event? Have we created such a cult of personality in the United States and such an appeal of celebrity that eventually someone with that kind of following will command so much power that they will be in a position to change the laws and change the regulations in a way that maybe turns out to be beneficial or maybe doesn't, because it's a kind of roll the dice? I mean, how do you see that?
There are points of light and reasons for optimism everywhere. We took childhood poverty down 50% with the child tax credit. Now, unfortunately, that didn't make it into the infrastructure bill. Someone cleared it out. And Kristen Sinema managed to get private equity carried interest back into the bill. So anyways, but there are points of light. We have a climate bill that is going to reduce carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. That is absolutely remarkable. Telehealth, remote medicine is if a mother's child has diabetes, and let's be honest, it's always the mom. She spends 5 months of her life managing that child's diabetes. With remote healthcare and the advances brought on by the pandemic, she should be able to get 1 or 2 months of that back for self-care, to make money, or to spend more time with her kids. A third of doctor's visits during the pandemic were remote. Before that, it was 1%. It's back to like 20 or 23%. And you can't get a vasectomy on your phone, but you can get the pre-op consultation and the post-op consultation and the physical therapy all digitally. There are a lot of people, I believe young people should get into an office for some of the reasons we talked about before, but there's going to be a new classification, or I think there should be a new classification of what are called a care worker, that if they're taking care of aging parents or taking care of young kids, you say to them, we're going to save you 10 to 20 hours a week by not forcing you to put on a pantsuit, blow dry your hair, and get on the Long Island Railroad and come into work 5 times a week. Maybe you come in once or twice. So there's enormous unlocks around remote medicine, enormous unlocks around remote work. There's enormous unlocks around technology to disperse healthcare, push primary healthcare into corners that ordinarily weren't using it. I'm an investor in something called 98.6 that does text-based remote healthcare. And a third of the people that text us saying, I feel like I have, a rash or something, I'm not sure what I should do about it, are texting us from a meeting. So I think there's opportunities everywhere.
But is what you're saying, Scott, that the opportunities to change are really going to come from the private sector? That there's really not much we can expect from the government given the gridlock that currently exists?
I don't think that's true. I think that even there's a movement towards ranked choice voting. Lisa Murkowski could win the Senate solely because it's ranked choice voting. And that is no longer this kind of, whoever's crazier on the left or right wins. We've passed an infrastructure bill. We've passed a student debt relief bill. We've passed a climate bill. If you look at the most valuable companies in the world, they all have one thing in common. I don't care if it's Google, Apple, Tesla. They're all a layer of innovation on top of forward-leaning investments by the government. GPS, DARPA, United States Postal Service. They take advantage of these enormous investments. We lent Tesla $450 million early when it was not a proven company. We provide $6,500 in EV tax credits. We're building charging stations all over the nation. So I think the government plays a big role. I think it's connective tissue, and I think they make great forward the CHIPS Act, where we're going to make sure we always have semiconductors available, because the bottom line is our tanks and our toasters all run on chips. And if Taiwan or South Korea, for whatever reason, either their supply or geopolitically decide not to ship us chips, that is a security risk. So I think the government plays a huge role. And I do think there's evidence that people are getting sick of the polarization. I think a lot of it begins online. I think we need to carve out to Section 230. I mean, there's a lot of solutions I'd like to
Let me
make.
ask you about that. So that's
Sure.
the thing, because I've been so sick of it for so long, I can't remember how long I've been sick of it for. And I know a lot of people that feel the same way. And yet, let's just take one area where this manifests most prominently, which is in the, quote, media. And when I say the media, I mean, it's what we're usually talking about there is cable TV and its derivatives. That doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be that people are hungry for even more radical, more aggressive, more mean, more accusatory content. That's in many cases dark, anxiety-provoking. I mean, you talk about this in the book, the anxiety, anger. So let's talk about that a little bit, about journalism, because people also have lost a lot of, again, there is a huge difference here, right? Republicans and conservatives versus liberals, or not even liberals, because a lot of the left's not liberal. I don't know what it's become. I wouldn't use the word liberal. So the left and the right and the conservative and whatever. And it's clearly the people on the right who have statistically, from what we've been able to see, lost much more trust. So what is it that's happening in journalism? Why is it, let's focus on people that don't trust journalism. How much of that is real? In other words, warranted? How much of that is perception? How much of that is misinformation, disinformation from foreign actors? I mean, like, how do you sort that out? Because you're like a giant media personality, so you live in this space.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So everything you said plays a role. So I would say, first off, about 40 years ago, the news was 30 minutes a day, and it was seen as a public service. ABC would run 30 minutes of television that didn't make any money because they were making so much money running ads for Tang on Brady Bunch and the Partridge Family. They thought, as a service, we need to have 30 minutes of news a night. And it was 21 minutes and 9 minutes of ads, and 18 minutes was news and 3 minutes was opinion, and made famous by the SNL parody of Jane, You Ignorant Slut, like two people arguing with each other for 3 minutes. Now it's flipped, and it's 3 minutes of news and 18 minutes of opinion because it's more entertaining. And Ted Turner and the Murdochs figured out that if we entertain people, we can keep them glued. Also, we need to scare the shit out of them, because a headline that reads "things marginally better today globally" doesn't sell newspapers. And so there's this situation room. When gas prices were skyrocketing, there were 21 headlines in the New York Times about rising gas prices. They've gone down, I think, 70 of the last 75 days. There's been one headline. So we love to scare people. And then we create this divisive content, which is more interesting, more fun. And then social media has a profit incentive to create fights online. Because from a user standpoint, when someone says something negative about me, I'm very engaged. I go back and I look at what else people are saying, if they're agreeing or disagreeing. And then I'm motivated to clap back at this person. And then people love that. It's like watching a fight in elementary school. Not only will people say fight, 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 but then they watch the fight. We're drawn towards, we're like Tyrannosaurus Rexes, or at least the algorithms. They like movement and they like violence. And these companies, because they're ad driven, want engagement, and the best way to get engagement is enragement. So an ad-supported media model that's been absolutely put on steroids creates a lot of polarization. I do think there's some hopeful signs. Ad-supported, kind of the best ad-supported or the most dramatic ad-supported media company in the world, Facebook, Meta, just hit a 5-year low in terms of its stock. The Trump rally, where they're having QAnon symbols, which I think is pretty hateful. If you look at the video from that rally, it looked kind of sad and pathetic, and like that shit's dying. I do think that there is a recognition. There's some very hopeful data. This one chart in the book shows the percentage of time people are spending helping people they have never met, right? Planting the trees of which the shade they will never sit under. It's up across the world. I don't know if it's the pandemic, but people are spending more time volunteering and helping people they've never met than ever before. And I also think a lot of us online, and I begins with the man in the mirror. I was the first person to clap back at someone when they said something or came after me. I get back. Now I don't. I'm trying to take the heat down. I'm trying to take the temperature down. And we all have an obligation to do that, to just be a little bit more civil. Even if we see an opportunity to make someone look stupid and get a ton of likes and have the Twitter algorithm go, wow, this is great. You really made them look like an idiot and people like what you're saying. And it tickles the tribal sensors, to just try and have the discipline and the grace not to say that, not to do it. And, you don't need to respond to every comment. People can get the better of you every once in a while. That's all right. So I think on an individual level, people are coming to that realization. I think people are looking for different sources of news. I think there's some very hopeful signs out there that some of these weapons, divisiveness are losing their power. I think there's now a recognition that foreign actors have weaponized these services. I'd like to see carve out some Section 230 that made these platforms liable. If an insurrection is organized on their platform and we find out that Russian actors have weaponized Twitter to make somebody organizing a women's march to slander and defame that person, that the platform should also probably be liable for that. So I do think people are coming to the recognition that whenever you have a massive increase in wealth, you have externalities. The greatest accretion in wealth in history was from converting fossil fuels to energy. And it's been the gift that's kept giving for the last century. There's tremendous externalities there. And also we know the longer we wait to address them, the more expensive they are to unwind. If you look at big tech, the externalities are enormous. And I think people are coming to recognize that we need to address them, whether it's making them liable for teen health, whether it's being better about cleaning up election misinformation. And I think the jig is up. I think people are realizing it's not as complex as they say it is. When they kick off one account for Twitter, 30 to 60% of election misinformation goes away. When Amazon gets critic bombed on The Lord of the Rings, they take down the comment section, they use AI and identity, and what do you know? They put it back up. It works, but Google and Facebook can't figure it out. So there are absolutely in my opinion, fallacy is that these problems are too complex to address. I find that is a standard gag reflex from people who have an economic incentive in not fixing them.
So I have another question. One of the things that we're kind of dancing around here is the phenomenon of misinformation. I mean, there's so many bad takes online. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people with a lot of followers and a lot of credibility among those followers promote some of these ideas. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also, to take the other side of the argument, it's very dangerous when you hear people talk about censoring content. I mean, content is censored, but what I mean is that this idea that somehow we can easily define what is and is not true or not true becomes increasingly difficult to do. It's fuzzier. So many things that subsequently found out were true were marked as misinformation. But I guess the thing that I struggle with, Scott, this is basically my last question. I mean, I wanted to ask you about TikTok too. Feel free, we could talk about that. I mean, I know you have some really interesting takes on that, but I don't know. I struggle with, man, because like a lot of these mainstream institutions, they produce a lot of garbage too. And they put out a lot of stuff that's not true. They pushed a lot of conspiracies that weren't true. They weren't labeled as conspiracies because it was a big institution putting it out there or a big cable news network putting it out there. But it's tough to know how to combat this, to try to kind of walk a middle line as a podcast host or as anyone in this field, because it's just very easy to get accused as a conspiracy theorist from one side and then as basically like a shill for the establishment by the other. And I don't know. I don't know how you navigate that line. I don't know what you think, how you try to inform yourself, like what people should be paying attention to, how they should be informing themselves.
Yeah, it's a huge one. And I think a decent place to start is that a pretty good proxy for a free and democratic society is that, generally speaking, you can say anything about anybody that you can say pretty much, because what is offensive and upsetting at one time ends up to have some veracity, and people should be able to have bad takes. What I don't think...
But sorry, just a quick interjection, though, because this is a point you've made before. Twitter's a private platform. It's not a public platform. So do those rules apply to corporations?
No. Corporations have no fidelity to the First Amendment. They wrap themselves in that bullshit blanket so they can continue to have fake accounts, spread misinformation, and act as if there's nothing they can do about it. They have absolutely no obligation to the First Amendment. The private companies, they can do whatever they want. If the First Amendment... I mean, that's like saying, well, every time Fox News runs a segment, they have to have Elizabeth Warren and AOC run their comments across the chyron. No, they don't. They can do whatever they want.
But when you have, I mean, you've talked about this too, there's an increased oligopoly, in some cases monopoly, with these platforms. So like when you have Twitter, which is basically the public square for journalists and a lot of sort of political talking heads, doesn't that start to bleed into sort of being a public square? Like that should play by public? No.
It's got a large following among people who have a decent amount of influence. First Amendment is the government shall pass no law that inhibits speech.
Sure.
And they haven't. It's not the public square, it's the private square. Spotify, in my opinion, had a very popular podcast host who had enormous influence over young people. And I don't think it was intentional, but I think he engaged in a level of both-sidism around vaccines that resulted in a lot of unnecessary death, disease, and disability. And I think Spotify, the very smart people at Spotify, knew that information probably wasn't going to be good for public health and engaged in it anyways. Does he have the right to say it? Yes. Does Spotify have the right to distribute that information? Yes. Do I need to distribute my podcast on Spotify? No. So in a capitalist free speech environment, part of my free speech was to pull Prof G off of Spotify. And I think that if you're talking about censorship, there's a difference between, we have slander and defamation laws. So for example, when Fox broadcast that Dominion voting machines may have been weaponized by people in Venezuela, it comes out they knew that wasn't true. It comes out that saying that is bad for Dominion's business. It comes out that we have laws around defamation and slander that make News Corp financially liable. And then the next week, every anchor from Lou Dobbs to Sean Hannity read a statement saying, we have no evidence that these voting machines were weaponized by anybody. Facebook doesn't have to do that. Facebook can let that information spread like wildfire, and conspiracy is fun, it's interesting, and it's different. And they can know that this is false, and they can let it run wild because of Section 230, same on Twitter. Or is it okay that if they decide Demetri is Tesla, he says Tesla is overvalued. So immediately thousands of bots start filling your feed, anonymous bots, saying that you are bad at what you do. And you were accused of a crime 5 years ago. And they start spreading misinformation about you. And it ends up that they aren't even people. If somebody believes that you're a bad person, they should be able to say that. But should they be able to say that if they're a bot and it's someone with a coordinated attack on you, based on your belief that impacts their economic well-being on a totally unrelated issue? Is that free speech? So I think there's a lot of gray area between letting people say things that might be offensive. Saying the world was not flat was very offensive at the time. So I think free speech is a wonderful thing, and I think we should err on the side of letting people say stuff. But should these platforms be engaged in a business model that favors? If you want to say, I believe that vaccines alter your DNA, I think you should have the right to say that on Facebook or Twitter. But should Facebook and Twitter be giving those comments more awareness and sunlight than other comments because they're so upsetting to people? So what you have is misinformation travels the world. It's like what Twain said, a lie will circle the globe 7 times before the truth puts its shoes on. But should these companies have a direct link with profitability and the spread of misinformation? So I'm not against them being able to say it on Facebook. I'm against Facebook having a profit motive for spreading misinformation.
Yeah. Scott, thank you so much. You've been more than generous with your time. Your book is going to be out, I think, the day after this episode drops. It publishes what day?
I think it's the 27th, Demetri.
The 27th. So if people want to find you, what's the best way to do that?
The problem isn't finding me. The problem is ignoring me. To resist is futile. I'm a total media pro. When I say pro, I mean prostitute. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm Prof. Galloway on Twitter, profgalloway.com online, and you can buy my book on Amazon, Adrift, American 100 Charts, or wherever you buy your books.
Scott, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Demetri. Congratulations on your success.
Thank you. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to full episodes, transcripts, and intelligence reports, which include additional notes, resources, links, and other material that will help you get the most out of each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website at hiddenforces.io. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.